Wow. Quincy Jones, one of the greatest luminaries in recorded music history, passed away at 91. And when people talk about different figures along the timeline of music history, there are levels to this. You hear that phrase all the time. And, some people were regionally successful. Some people were successful for like a pocket of time. It could be anywhere from 1 year to 2 years to 5, even 10 years. Some music figures specialize in a particular genre for a period of time or for a long time. But it is not hyperbole or an exaggeration to say Quincy Jones might be the greatest music producer in modern music history. Like, if you were to make a Mount Rushmore of the greatest music producers and you had to select 4, that Mount Rushmore would not be credible if it didn't include Quincy Jones. And I know that at the most basic level, like if somebody isn't like a music history buff and they know the bare minimum, right, of different genres, different music history aspects, at the most basic level, Quincy Jones might be known as the guy who produced Michael Jackson's Thriller. But it is so important to understand that he didn't just fall into that position as Michael Jackson's chief producer. There were decades of accomplishments and great achievements, literally decades, that led up to him being in position to be Michael Jackson's producer for those 3 classic albums. I'm talking about 79's Off the Wall, 1982's Thriller, and 1987's Bad. Thriller remains the greatest selling album of all time. So that is the absolute pinnacle of pop success. But if you look at his history and his career, and quite frankly, his life, Quincy Jones has been extraordinary. I mean, you want to talk about exceptionalism. Quincy Jones truly embodied that. And when you look at the outpour from the music community, from the entertainment community, from the political, it doesn't matter the industry, you've got an outpour of people giving their condolences and giving their rest in pieces to Quincy Jones. And it runs the gamut in terms of who is voicing their love and appreciation of Quincy Jones. He served as many people's mentor. He put so many people on entertainment wise. This guy was a major connector, not just a great composer, producer, arranger, songwriter, not just that, but he has dropped pearls of wisdom to so many. And you see individualized anecdotes on what Quincy Jones gave to them advice-wise. Like, many people don't know, Oprah Winfrey, Oprah got her mega start through The Color Purple, which Quincy Jones produced and scored. So Quincy Jones is largely credited with helping put Oprah on and exposing Oprah to the public. Quincy Jones helped get Will Smith his multimedia career going by giving Will Smith a huge TV break by producing the show The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Yeah, that was a Quincy Jones produced show. And who knows if Will Smith goes on to have the great career that he has in acting and in music if it wasn't for Quincy Jones giving him that big break. And that, those assists, if you will, are just scratching the surface. This guy's impact beyond what he had his hands on musically was so immense. So if you rewind it back to his early childhood, he had a rough upbringing. He didn't have a nurturing family that he was raised in. His mom was schizophrenic and institutionalized. She was nearly out of his life by the time he was like 11. And his dad was unable to take care of him, so he had to live with his grandma, a former slave. And Quincy Jones's childhood, I mean, he grew up in a rough part of Chicago. He got stabbed in the hand as a young kid. He was exposed to the streets at a young age. He was just running around, committing crimes and so forth. He found music through finding a piano in a building that he had broken into with his friends, started playing with the keys, discovered quickly that he had an obsession and a love for music. And then by the time he was 14 years old, he had started picking up different instruments, getting very proficient in them. He was playing alongside Count Basie by the time he was 14, and he was playing with the likes of Clark Terry. I'm talking jazz legends. He was playing backup for some of them by the time he was 14, 15. So yeah, he got started. Once he discovered that he loved music, he was just off to the races. And then he landed a big opportunity being a part of Lionel Hampton's band. This is another jazz legend. We're talking in the 1950s, early 50s. He went from Lionel Hampton's band to getting a big break when Dinah Washington, against her label's wishes, wanted Quincy Jones to arrange and produce her next album. So Quincy Jones arranged Dinah Washington's 1955 album, For Those in Love, her 1957 album, The Swingin' Miss D. Listen to that one. That one is so, how should I put it? Like, you can't listen to that one without tapping your foot and starting to move to it. So Quincy Jones was kind of a prodigy, not at the ages of like 5 through 10, but once he got started, his reputation started growing, especially when he got that big break after playing with Lionel Hampton, arranging Dinah Washington's albums, and then he started getting more work with other artists. So in the mid to late 50s, he arranged for Count Basie, Sarah Vaughan, Clark Terry, Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie. We're talking absolute legends. And again, by this point, Quincy Jones is barely 20, 22, 23 years old. This is young Quincy, 1950s, arranging for some of the biggest, most legendary artists of that era. And well before that, when Quincy Jones was about 14, he had met Ray Charles, who was then about 16. So they kind of had a big brother, little brother relationship, and they grew to become like the best of friends. Quincy Jones and Ray Charles at a very, very young age. And Quincy Jones would compose and arrange for Ray Charles later down the line. So after that 1950s run, up until about 57, Quincy Jones really wanted to grow musically. He was like studying music. He wanted to like write a lot more. And in the 50s in New York City, which is where Quincy Jones was based in around that time, they wouldn't allow black arrangers do the writing for the string sections. So Quincy Jones then moves to Paris, France to study with Nadia Boulanger, who was known as the Queen of Classical Music. This woman, she mentored Igor Stravinsky. Like, this is big time. And Quincy's studying with her in Paris. And she dropped some wisdom, words that he said he never let go of, that she gave him, were there are only 12 notes, right? In the language of music, there are only 12 notes. You need to investigate how all of these different arrangers, composers, how they used and what they did with those 12 notes. Quincy Jones used that kind of as a mantra going forward. So Quincy Jones then like assembled a band out there in Paris. They had a show for a while and then they were touring, just touring all around Europe. And this wasn't cheap. And so at some point, Quincy Jones was pretty damn near penniless. He was in debt and they couldn't continue as they were going. So Quincy Jones returned home. He left Paris, returned to the States, and because he needed money, he got a job, but it wasn't just any job. He got a job as a VP, a record exec at Mercury Records. And so he had to kind of switch from his jazz background, which he was already looking to expand from. That's why he went to Paris, because he didn't want to only study jazz. He wanted to study classical, all different forms of music. So at this point, he's got to switch over to pop music, which he thought would be easy, but ended up being more challenging than he thought. So he's listening to a bunch of demos. He lands on an artist that he wants to work with, Leslie Gore. He ends up producing for her. One of those hit songs that they worked on together was It's My Party. You've probably heard that 1963 hit. It's my party and I'll cry if I want to. Yeah, that was Quincy Jones producing that one. So they had a few hits together. Then in 1964, Quincy Jones gets a call that will change his life from Frank Sinatra, who wanted Quincy Jones to arrange for him. This ended up leading to a super successful run between Frank Sinatra and Quincy Jones. And if you listen to what Frank Sinatra over the years said about Quincy Jones, his ability and about their friendship, this was truly a bond between them. Frank Sinatra changed Quincy Jones' life, not only musically, but also just kind of how to live the high life. Quincy Jones started to get, not that he wasn't into women, into drinking before, but hanging with Frank Sinatra, because this is 1963. Frank Sinatra had already had a super lucrative 1940s and 1950s. So this is mid 60s Frank Sinatra, who's basically running things, right? So the exposure and the doors that Frank Sinatra would open for Quincy Jones were immense. And again, they ended up being like the best of friends. You know, there was a ring that Frank Sinatra was wearing for 40 years before he passed away. He gave that ring to Quincy Jones, who said, "I'll never take this ring off." And Frank Sinatra would speak so highly about Quincy Jones's musicianship, say, "I have never had so much fun and had such an exciting arranger, producer to work with as Quincy Jones." And a lot of the cities that they would be playing in, they would have the black producers, musicians be able to play in the venue, but couldn't go to the restaurants, couldn't stay at the hotels. So when this reality struck Frank Sinatra, he was able to do something about it in Las Vegas, because the pairing for the album was Frank Sinatra and Count Basie. That was the first one that they had worked on together that Quincy Jones produced. He paired Frank Sinatra and Count Basie and his band. So it was a hell of a partnership. They did like Fly Me to the Moon together. But Frank Sinatra was disgusted, and he basically gave an ultimatum. He's like, if they need to stay on the other side of town, then you must not need me. So he was basically like, if you want me, you're gonna have to treat them with some dignity. And Quincy Jones spoke so appreciatively about Frank Sinatra really making that effort to change how black musicians, because like even Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't able to stay where like the rest of his colleagues and his partners, if they were white, would be staying. So Frank Sinatra actually did something about this. And this was only one instance of how Quincy Jones would be in his ascension musically, would be knocking down and breaking down barriers one by one. I mean, he became like the first arranger, musical director of the Academy Awards. Think about that. He became like the first black arranger to be scoring white-led films. And after working with Frank Sinatra, that was the next move Quincy Jones wanted to make. He wanted to go from basically being New York and Vegas based to getting over to LA and scoring films. That was the next big hurdle, because the big names in the game were like Henry Mancini. And so Quincy Jones wanted to earn some success in that realm, and boy did he. Whether you're talking about In Cold Blood, For the Love of Ivy, over a decade later, Roots, and of course Quincy Jones produced The Wiz, and that's where he would meet Michael Jackson. And Michael Jackson would eventually want, well, first he wanted Quincy Jones to find him a producer for his upcoming album, which would become Off the Wall, because this is where Michael Jackson is trying to kind of break from the perception people had of him, first from the Jackson 5, then from the Jacksons. And so The Wiz was a big turning point for Michael Jackson. And yeah, he went from wanting Quincy Jones to find him a producer to Quincy Jones saying, you know what, I want to take a shot at your album. And then the rest is history. So, you know, I've only really talked about early Quincy Jones' career, but this just goes to show you how esteemed he was before he even got with Michael Jackson. I haven't even gone through the 70s of Quincy Jones' career, where he had great albums like Body Heat. And there's so many different parts of Quincy Jones's career that you could pick from. But I'm gonna do further videos just kind of spotlighting different aspects of the legendary career and life of Quincy Jones. And by the way, there are things that you would have never even thought of. Like, did you know that the Austin Powers theme song, that like that was a Quincy Jones song from his 1960s. It was somewhere in the 60s. The album was Big Band Bossa Nova, and I think the song is like Soul Bossa Nova or something like that. That's where the Austin Powers theme song comes from. It's straight off of a Quincy Jones song. A lot of people don't know that, you know, the Far Sides, the sounds of the Far Sides Passing Me By, that iconic sound. You play Far Side, P-H-A-R-C-Y-D-E, play Passing Me By. You listen to that early sound in the beginning of the track. That is from a Quincy Jones song called Summer in the City. And again, all of this only scratches the surface. There's not enough that could be said. By the way, there is a great documentary. It's on Netflix. It came out a few years ago. It's called Quincy. If you want kind of like a nice, comprehensive Quincy Jones look at his life and career, check that documentary out. But yeah, Quincy Jones has great solo albums like 1982's The Dude. Look at how many awards, Grammys, Academy Awards he's been nominated in, how many he's won. He's won Producer of the Year. Like, the only person who's got more Producers of the Year than him is like Babyface. And trust me, if they had that category before the 1960s, Quincy Jones would have probably won more of those. So yeah, we're gonna circle back and we're gonna talk more about Quincy Jones's 70s, 80s, and even 90s. Like this guy, again, he was everybody's friend. Everybody's got something very nice to say about Quincy Jones. And yes, he was very outspoken. He spoke his mind and he was very direct. And in recent years, he has said some things that had people say like, damn, about Michael Jackson, about the Beatles. Like he became more outspoken when he would speak to certain publications very late in his life, but he was always a straight shooter. And again, in the next video, we're going to get into a lot of the Quincy Jones, Michael Jackson history, as well as the other works. We Are the World, the iconic charity song that Quincy Jones wrote and produced. I think it was actually written by Michael Jackson and I think Lionel Richie, produced again by Quincy Jones. I think that was 1985. But yeah, when you listen to certain things that Quincy Jones produced like in the 80s and even 90s, it's hard to imagine that this is the same guy who was doing those 1950s arrangements. So he was in the game for 70 plus years. That is almost unparalleled, especially when you consider the sustained success and the different types of success that he had throughout his career. So yeah, why don't you drop something in the comments if you have any strong opinions about Quincy Jones, his life, his career, his body of work. Incredible, incredible. And again, we're just scratching the surface. Rest in peace to the great Quincy Jones. We're going to have a lot more to discuss in the coming weeks and months because this truly is a career to be celebrated. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love music like I do. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.